Now we're continuing in the notes that were made available at the on the website before class last time. Those notes were for both last Wednesday and for today. Now on Wednesday we're going to spend one class session on persecution in the history of the church. And most of that, of course, will focus on suffering by those who believed in the principles and concepts of Christianity. However, there will be one small section where we talk about Christianity persecuting others as well. And that's some of the darker parts of Christian history. Yes, Calvin is a good example, sadly. Now, before we actually start what might be considered the lecture part of this, I've asked two of the guys who wrote papers that are reflected in what we're going to be talking about today as well as last Wednesday to present their papers. Brad has a paper on Codex Sinaiticus, one of the three major early copies of practically the whole Bible, especially the New Testament. It was only discovered in the 1800s and is still relied on today as an excellent example of what the early text was like, and he'll inform us about that. And then following that, we'll have a report on Jerome. We covered him when we came through the late 300s, early 400s. He was important for several reasons, but the one he's remembered most long-lastingly for is actually translating copies of the Old Testament and New Testament that he had available in his day into Latin. And that has come to be called the Latin Vulgate. Vulgate meaning the common language. And Latin was the common language of the Western Church by that time. And it plays a key role in us knowing more about what the text is like. So we'll have Brad come up and present his. Let me get this mic off so we can put it on him, and then we'll have the... Yeah, we'll let you have a couple of questions afterwards. So come on up, Brad.
Hey, wait, that's how it's going. Come on now.
You can always say, I refuse to answer on the ground that it might tend to incriminate me. Okay.
AKA, I plead the fifth.
Preach the word.
Preach the Codex. So mine was on the Codex Sinaiticus, or the Sinaiticus, or there's about 4 different ways you can pronounce it. We'll discuss briefly some of the history behind the finding of it. But I want to set the stage a little bit for you. I want you to imagine yourself being hoisted up into a 6th century monastery. The very same way that the monks would have used this and entered this place several hundred years ago. Utilizing a small wooden cage that resembled like a human bird cage. Several men at the top would operate a revolving mechanism that would tighten a rope, and they just would walk in circle to raise someone up into this place. And it was several stories into the air. It was the entrance to the monastery. At the top of this mysterious entranceway opens up into the elevated depths of the monastery. In the early 18th century, this is the setting of how the earliest ancient manuscript of the Greek New Testament was found, which also contained incomplete parts of the Old Testament. Constantine von Tischendorf took this very journey and is credited to have discovered this 4th century treasure in the St. Catherine Monastery in 1844. At the foot of Mount Sinai, yes, the Mount Sinai from the Bible, in northeast Egypt, stands the monastery, which was built in AD 565, and behind the name given to this unique and wonderful treasure, the Codex Sinaiticus. Codices, or ancient manuscripts, are important historical finds because they serve as witnesses to the writings we have today. This ancient text is the oldest copy in full of the New Testament Bible. As scribes were used over the ages, One mistake may turn into many mistakes, as we can only imagine. So it's important that these would be passed on through the future of the translations. It's important to know that that mistake would be passed on through the future of the translation. So the older a discovered manuscript is, the more pure it was from the apostolic age. This copy being compiled about 300 years after the apostles does not make it flawless to God's inspired word. With that said, I'd like to make a little bit of a disclaimer. As Christians, we understand that God has been preserving His message since it was recorded by inspired men. Matthew, the inspired author of God, records Jesus' words in this matter in the 5th chapter of Matthew in the 18th verse. I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till it is all fulfilled. His words are very clear that not even a literal punctuation will be lost, and we can have assurance that the words spoken by God through the inspired Scriptures are His words to the end of the earth. This confidence is instilled in Christians through historical accuracy, and faith must be established when looking at discovered evidences such as the Codex Sinaiticus, or Sinaiticus. Particular areas of interest that will be discussed pertaining to the Codex are its physical makeup, the contents of the Codex itself, and its overall acceptance in the Christendom world. Examining the forensics behind such a document bring an understanding to how much time, money, and resources were used to continue on writings that came from God Himself. The financial obligation to create this manuscript would have been equal to one lifetime of wages for one individual in the 4th century. The Greek New Testament Bible in its complete form was the oldest of its time, but it also contained many books of the Old Testament. Unfortunately, only parts of the Old Law survived the several hundred years of time before being discovered. It is understood that not just one scribe was used in its copy. Many believe that there were 3 scribes and 5 correctors. Interesting, the abilities of the scribes were seen and even graded, from their spelling abilities to how unusual their mistakes were. Modern analysis reveals that each scribe handled a particular section of the book. The first scribe was responsible for the Old Testament, historical and poetical books, a vast majority of the New Testament, and also the Epistle of Barnabas. The second took care of copying of the books of the prophets and the Shepherd of Hermas. The last scribe handled all of the Tobit and the Judith, the first half of the 4 Maccabees, the first 2/3 of the Psalms, and the first 5 verses of Revelation. The pages were made from calf and sheepskin, a common parchment used for this type of manuscript. It is estimated that 360 animals were used to construct the entirety of this early Bible. Interesting to mention, the arm hair imprints can be seen at the bottom of these pages as the scribes were tediously copying the text onto the parchment. The Codex Sinaiticus inks, the inks that they use, have never been chemically characterized, and the type and proportions of ingredients mixed together have never been determined. As mentioned, the Codex was compiled around the 4th century, with some estimating to be around 350. The religious councils were having an impact on deciphering apocryphal writings from canonical ones. All 27 books that are found in today's modern New Testament are present in the Codex Sinaiticus. This would agree to the range of dating in historical accounts. The Council of Nicaea in 325 began inspirational tests to determine authorship from God, removing the books that proved earthly authorship. In 367, the Bishop of Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a letter on Easter listing the 27 books we have today and that were found in the Codex Sinaiticus. One interesting note is the order of the books that they were found in. The books of the New Testament are arranged in this order: the 4 Gospels, the Epistle of Paul, Hebrews follows 2 Thessalonians, the Acts of the Apostles, the general epistles, and the book of Revelation. This does not change the content that is found within the pages, yet with certain pages showing more worn than others, it appears that they may have been stored in different places throughout history. There are differing opinions on the overall acceptance of the Codex in Christendom. Not a surprising statement in man's understanding on religious matters. In 1862, a claim was made by Constantine Simonides that he forged the Codex, writing it for himself for monetary gain, benefiting Tischendorf. His contact with Tischendorf was plausible, but after several fraud exposes from him, the claim lost validity. Another scholar held the opinion that the Codex Sinaiticus, along with the other two known codices, the Vaticanus and the Bezae, were corrupt and exhibited fabricated text. However, it is important to understand that there are 5,600 manuscripts of the New Testament that compile 99.5% identified by AD 130. Therefore, Christendom does not and should not treat the codices as sole authority in New Testament translations. Further studies revealed many omitted verses in the Codex Sinaiticus, corrections made by its editors, and other textual disagreements with the majority of New Testament Greek manuscripts. The Codex Sinaiticus has been a major source of study and interest since its discovery in 1844. Over the past decade, all the parts of this manuscript have been made available in digital through the Codex Sinaiticus project and its website. As advancements in technology increase, and additional revelations may be made through detailed investigations. With its discovery well after its creation, it is likely that there are additional manuscripts to be discovered. Until another full New Testament Bible is found that can be dated prior to the 4th century, the Codex Sinaiticus will remain as the oldest New Testament Bible ever found. Thank you.
Answer a question or two if you're willing.
So if
Disclaimer, I'm not a scholar on this topic. Yes, Cooper.
All right, so what you said towards the end, that it shouldn't be treated as the ultimate authority. Why is that? My first thought would be if it's the oldest, most complete that we have, shouldn't we be judging other texts by this text and not the other way around?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to refer to our professor for that answer. From the studies, in 350, when they had the inspirational writing test, so are you referring to specific scripture, or are you referring to specific books?
I'm talking about the
New Testament?
the reliability of the text itself. Like you said it shouldn't be treated as the authority in translations.
He said soul.
Soul,
Yeah.
not the soul. But I'm thinking, like, why not? Shouldn't that be the standard if it's the best we have of other texts?
Well,
not the other way around?
I understand what you're saying, but when you have that many hundreds of copies, and let's say, for example, this codex had omitted certain verses, however, 3,000 other copies or transcripts that we have didn't omit that, you kind of would want to take the ones that have been completed that agreed in harmony with each other versus just this sole one codex. Does that make sense? They need to make harmony. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Man, let me put that one back in my pocket. Any other questions? Thank you, Cooper. That's a great question.
Yeah, since the Maccabees were involved in it, so if we're going to take this with any credibility, it also would be awesome to do the Maccabees.
What did the shepherd of Hermas say in chapter 2, verse 2?
The shepherd of Hermas was considered scriptural.
Perhaps you noticed in Brad's report that even though no one asked a question about it afterwards, there were some additional books that were a part of the Codex Sinaiticus besides just the 27 New Testament books and the Old Testament, even though part of the Old Testament is missing.
Have you read Gospel of Barnabas, bro?
I have not read the entire thing. I've read parts of it.
How long is it?
I get the impression that it's probably a little bit longer than maybe like the book of Hebrews or something.
Anybody else read it yet?
But I was just going to add to the question, or the answer to the question, which that is accurate. Just because it's a complete New Testament does not mean that somehow makes it the final sole authority, because there are individual books of our New Testament that are actually older than it is. And so the tendency would be to trust them even above Codex Sinaiticus. But what's so impressive about this is it clearly is communicating that by somewhere between AD 325 and AD 350, they were bringing it all together under one cover at great expense, as was pointed out, just to make one copy of the entire Bible in vellum or parchment, which this was animal skin that was cleaned and scraped until it was very thin, not a whole lot thicker than what we would say index card thickness today of paper. Would take the skins of approximately 360 animals just to make one Bible. And take years for these several men working together to make it. They probably were making in different parts, and then it was brought all together and bound. We're not even sure if it was actually originally made at St. Catherine's Monastery. Most likely not, but it's possible it was. And then has been kept there all these hundreds of years. I'd be interested in knowing why you had to be pulled up by a winch and a cage even to get to St. Catherine's. Were they try to keep other people out or keep those guys in? But that just was something of the nature of the monastery system for a great period of time. But a great report. I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
I remember when I was in Islam, and I remember one day I was in the mosque, and I remember seeing the Gospel of Barnabas, as something of a reading that the community Muslims was actually looking at. I don't know if I still have it, but I know I've seen the face of it. You know what I mean?
Yes. Right, and that might have some part in our discussion later in our, what we're covering today. Okay, Stephen is going to come up and talk to us about St. Jerome, as he's labeled in the history, and the Latin Vulgate, and that'll give us a chance to talk some about what the value, something not even in the original language, and what that might still have for us today.
This works, so I'll let you do it.
No problem, it's already on, so we're being recorded, there you go.
All right, sweet. Yeah, sure. All right, so my paper was over St. Jerome in the Latin Vulgate. And St. Jerome was born with the name Eusebius Harmonius in March 27th, 347 AD in the town of Stridon, a town in Dalmatia, a Roman province at that time, which we now call modern-day Slovenia or Slovak. He also had an alternative name, which we use as our middle names. It was Sophronius. He moved to Rome in the year 360 when he was 12 and studied grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. It was under his teacher, Aelius Donatus, who was best known for his commentaries on the comedies of Terence. It was during his tenure that he rejected his Christian upbringing and he started to embrace the culture of the Roman society. It was his Christian faith that won out in the end. This is due to the fact that he had spent time in the Roman catacombs, and it reminded him about hell and what he had heard before going down the path that he was on the moment. Here's a quote from him that explains how he was feeling at that time. Often I would find myself entering those crypts, deep dug in the earth, with their walls on either side lined with the bodies of the dead, where everything was so dark that it almost seemed as though the psalmist's words were fulfilled. Let them go down quick into hell, here and there the light, not entering through the windows, but filtering down from above through shafts. Relieve the horror of darkness, but again, as soon as you found yourself cautiously moving forward, the black night closed around, and there came to my mind the line of Virgil, honor ubic anamos semi, whatever, something weird. I don't know. This led him to being baptized in 366, and it was actually by Pope Liberius. Just for a small bit of history, Pope Liberius actually went into exile, is known for being falsely accused by a heretical set of Christians known at that time as the Arians. He then went on to the school in Trier, or modern-day Germany, and started serious studies in theology. After this, he went on to Aquila, which is now modern-day Italy. He spent time among those who were considered at the time with what they called the aesthetic elite. To clarify terms, this means people who go and actually search for suffering and for a spiritual or disciplinary purpose, what is now known as piety to some. Here are some names of these men. Tyrannus Rufinus, who was known for his commentary on the Apostles' Creed and even a book on church history at that time. While he was still connected to many of these men of spiritual integrity and who were God-fearing, Jerome still read pagan literature and studied Cicero, the great father of rhetoric. He had a dream during this time that he went before the church council as was severely beaten for being more of a disciple of Cicero than of Jesus. He had a fever during this time too, which also could account for the dream he had. Either way, it was after that time that he vowed not to read any more pagan literature and start to devote himself fully to the work of the Lord. He started his writings with the earliest known writing of the work being De Septis per Causa, or known in English as Concerning Seven Beatings. This was more than likely written in the years 373 to 374. This was also during the time of his illness, and was after this encounter that he went and had a short stint in a monastery. Some sources say 2 years, others say he stayed for a 5-year stint. Either way, it was short-lived. After getting tired of being alone and not making it as a monk, he then went. He was then asked by Pope Damasus to start a translation of the Bible from Greek to Hebrew into the Latin language. This started in the year 382, and he was just to revise the Gospels from the old Latin texts known as the Vetus Latina at that time and compare it to the best Greek texts. Before the death of the Pope at that time, his task was complete. This was only 2 years after he had started the work, meaning he completed by 384 AD. He also completed another work during this time, which is said to be lost and he wanted nothing to do with. It was a Latin Psalter. This was best known to, the Roman Psalter, as it was used in Rome at that time. It was translated into Latin and used in the liturgy at that time. This was all during the same time period. In 390, he then began his work on the Latin Vulgate. Unlike most scholars of his day and translators in general, he started the translation using the original Hebrew. Most of the translations of that time were of the Septuagint, which was the Greek work of the Old Testament. Before this, the only translation they had into Latin came from that text. Not saying it was not valid, but it was not the most scholarly or the best translation to translate into Latin. I forgot to mention that in Bethlehem that he started this work. This is what actually led to his work, is the fact that the Jews kept stating that the Christian Bible they had at that time was an error. So he began and actually sat under a converted Jew or a rabbi and learned Hebrew intently. Not only did he translate these books and even what we would call the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books, but he wrote many commentaries on these books as well. He even translates some of Origen's commentaries. He's also known for his works on the commonly known doctrine, the perpetual virginity of Mary. This view was held by the Catholic Church today that says that Mary, Jesus' mom, remained a virgin until death. There were competing views, however, from the heretical Arians and even Jovinians who had the opposite view. He even wrote in a defense of the doctrine of Helvidius, who was like the others who at that time were defending the view. This also proves the point that where Jerome disagreed or thought you were wrong on something, he was rather harsh and made more enemies than friends. From his numerous letters back and forth, even between his old friend Rufinus, he was quite clear and had no leeway for anyone who had a contrary opinion to the one he thought was the biblical one. Jerome, having lived a full life in the dedication to the work of not only the church but Christ, he died September 30th of 420. He has inspired many Christians after our time. One of his contemporaries, and known as someone who at least was an acquaintance, was Augustine of Hippo, better known as St. Augustine. Without this man, we would not have a lot of the Bible nor scholarly knowledge we have today. He is second only to Augustine in the number of writings that we have from those of the early church fathers. His translation of the Bible, although not perfect, was the best of its time for their language. It was the accepted translation for the church at that time, and actually over a millennium. It was over 1,000 years that it was the accepted translation of the Catholic Church. When we think of Jerome, we should think of what a great man of God. He is considered to be the patron saint of scholars, interpreters, translators, librarians, and also students. This man is one we owe an immense amount of respect, and thank you for his loyalty and time committed to the work of God. All right.
Question.
Oh, yeah, whatever. Yeah, who has a question? Yeah, no one.
Cooper.
No, I'm just playing. What do you need, bro?
So, is there really much discrepancy with Old Testament translations that we have and the Septuagint and the Vulgate? Because those are all Old Testament translations. Did you read anything about the discrepancy there? Because they said they were concerned about it. The Jews were saying.
Yeah, the Jews were concerned because the Septuagint was the Greek, and a lot of the scholars, all they were doing, they weren't even going back to the original Hebrew.
Right.
They were just going to the Septuagint.
Were they pointing out anything particular like this is?
I'm not real sure on that. I do know that they were like pretty much saying like, okay, you're not even going back to the original Hebrew. You're going to the Greek, and you're not even reading like what is said. So that's one of the main reasons Jerome, became a scholar of Hebrew and started researching that was, he didn't want to be accused of not doing that. So, all right.
Yeah, some of the things about that, you can stay up here. Steve.
Oh, okay. All right. Awesome.
Think for a moment. We said, maybe last Wednesday, it has come up at least sometime in our discussion, that for a long time the oldest copy of the Old Testament we had in Hebrew was what? 900 AD. Mm-hmm. It was a manuscript from 900 AD that was in a Russian museum or church or something. That was the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Old Testament we had. But here's Jerome accessing the Hebrew Old Testament in what date?
Yeah, that was
AD 400.
Yeah, 8400. Yeah.
So he had a 500 year earlier copy, at least, than we have today. And so one reason scholars still look at the Vulgate is not just to see how good a job he did of translating, although that's pretty obvious. For a single man translation, it actually was quite good. But in the Old Testament, it helps us compare what the Hebrew text looked like in AD 400 as compared to AD 900, which is what we mostly have today, and was actually the best resource we had until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we have many of the Old Testament books going back to before AD, back to 100 BC or even earlier. So there's several reasons why the Latin Vulgate was very valuable. Another one, and I guess I'll let you go ahead and go sit down here.
All right. Yeah. Whoa.
Yeah, wrong
No,
one.
I got you. I'll grab it. I got you. There you are. Yeah. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Good job, Steve-O. Good job, Steve-O.
A second thing to realize that when Erasmus, remember who Erasmus was? The Greek scholar in the 1500s who put together a copy of the Greek New Testament, actually went through several revisions of it and so forth. He was challenged in his New Testament by some who argued, well, you left some verses out. And even with the Greek manuscripts he was looking at from 1200 and 1300 AD, a few verses, very few verses, were not in there that people were used to hearing in their readings of the Scripture from their time. And he even challenged them. He said, if you can provide one ancient document that shows those Scriptures are supposed to be in there, I'll put them back in. Well, one of them is in 1 John. Remember, there's that passage that says there's three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and there's three that bear witness on earth. Well, part of that is not in the oldest Greek manuscripts. And it wasn't in the Greek manuscripts he was using, and so he had left that part out. And so someone from the Catholic Church shows up. Remember, he was Catholic all of his life, even though very liberal by Catholic standards. That doesn't mean liberal in the modern sense of liberal. They actually produced as I remember the story, a late copy of a Greek manuscript that had actually been translated back from Latin into Greek with that verse in there. Because in the Latin Vulgate, that verse is there. And so he put it in. And that's why then when the King James translation was made, some 60 years later perhaps after that. You find that in the King James translation because they lean very heavily on the Greek text that Erasmus had produced. And he had put those verses back in, that one in particular in 1 John, based on this one very late Greek manuscript that some suspect was actually a forgery, because they had translated it back from Latin into Greek, and that's not how it's supposed to work. But nevertheless, it has had a profound effect. It is the Bible that Martin Luther would have studied before he ever began his push back against the church and his 95 Theses and all of that. This is the Bible he would have been teaching from there at the University of Wittenberg as he was teaching the book of Romans and teaching New Testament and so forth as a professor there. And that is true not just of him, but hundreds and thousands of men down through the centuries from Jerome's day up until finally more scholarly translations came out. It's only been in very recent times, actually, 1955, 1960, somewhere around there, the Catholic Church finally said that officially other translations other than the Latin Vulgate could actually be used in their services. So it's been a very powerful influence for Christianity and overwhelmingly good. All from the work of just one man, though normally you want to shy away from translations done by one person. The ancients didn't necessarily feel that same way about it. Then I can address a little bit more what Cooper was asking about, what was wrong with, why did Jews object to using the extant Latin translations that already existed before Jerome did his, because the earlier Latin translation was, first of all, the quality of the translation was considered inferior at the time. And that's part of the reason the church, the Pope, as now we label him, even though at that time he wasn't being called Pope yet, the Bishop of Rome recognized the Latin translation was inferior, and so he wanted a new one done by a scholar, and Jerome was a scholar. If a guy can take 2 years and learn Hebrew well enough to translate the Old Testament, he's a scholar. Yeah. So, but more than that, there are a number of differences between the Septuagint Old Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament. And Jewish people then, and some even now, will argue, well, if you're going to talk to me about the Messiah in the Old Testament, talk to me from the Hebrew, not from the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Because it's in some of those passages that little changes, there's some differences that they would argue, well, in the Hebrew, that's not there. In the Septuagint, it is. And I'm not trying to explain why that's the case or whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what Jewish people, Jewish scholars today say, is speak to me out of the Hebrew text. Yeah.
Do you know what possible verses or an example of maybe one?
I'm not qualified to speak on that. I've got the books in my library, but none come to mind specifically. Just usually the difference of maybe just one word in one place or another that would make a difference. Right. We see actually in the New Testament, the writers in the New Testament acknowledge that. And they acknowledge it from the standpoint that almost every time they quote a messianic prophecy from the Old Testament, they're quoting from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew version.
And they say it is written?
Say again?
When they say it is written?
Yes, when they say it is written, and they're actually quoting, especially if it's a messianic prophecy like Matthew. Almost all of Matthew's quotes of messianic prophecies are from the Septuagint. Even though he knew Hebrew, and probably his audience were Jewish people, he quotes from the Septuagint. And this is just part of the quandary, a little quandary you get into when you get deep enough into this whole thing of translations and different texts and so forth. And yet, even with those seeming discrepancies, if you are working from the Hebrew text, and I'm having to rely on those who know Hebrew and do that enough to speak, there's still plenty of messianic prophecies there that seem to be clearly fulfilled in the life of Jesus, even when you're just going just with the Hebrew. Just a few other ones that may be a little more outstanding that seem to stand out so much more in the Septuagint than they do in the Hebrew. Yes, sir.
So this is interesting. So before the Dead Sea Scrolls, you said the oldest Hebrew text we had was 900 AD.
Roughly, yes. Actually, I think they put it like 925, but yeah.
So there seems to be a great value then in either the Vulgate or the Septuagint
Yeah,
in getting.
that's right.
But then after the Dead Sea Scrolls, then you would think, okay, well, they're like 150 BC, but that's right around or just a little after the Septuagint was made. So
Mhm.
Septuagint is still maybe a little earlier, but it's also a translation.
Yeah.
So which one is way more heavily valuable? Because one could almost still say, well, maybe the Septuagint had better texts to work with with their translation than what we have.
Yeah, the sort of the point of, and scholars vary on this, but sort of the general point of view, it seems to me, of the scholars about what you're addressing is that we don't go with any one of them. We still try to see what the preponderance of the evidence is, and they give different weightings to, how old it is and where it came from. But they definitely see the value of the Septuagint because it's reflecting a Hebrew text from about 225 BC. That's, because that's about when the Septuagint was made. And it's by Jews who made it. They're not Jerome, a Slovak, who learned Hebrew. It's by men who spoke it all their life and heard the text spoken all their life in their synagogue and so forth. And they make that translation. And it's, for a scholarly discussion, way above my pay level to talk about whether they got it right. But clearly those scholars who made that translation, and there was quite a number of them. In fact, the word Septuagint means, what, 70?
70, yeah.
It means 70. It's commonly accepted that there were 70 Jewish scholars, and they were convinced that the Hebrew text they were working from was the most accurate available. And so from that perspective, even though the Septuagint is, you lose a little in translation always, still it may actually reflect a more accurate text than the Hebrew text that Jewish people are using today. Because theirs, just like ours, is based on that one from 925 AD. And
And remind me the order again, the 70 Jewish scholars were taken.
70 Jewish scholars, 225 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. 225 BC, translated the Hebrew text they had at that time into Greek.
So was it Old
Testament. Old Testament, yeah.
to Greek?
Uh-huh.
Right, okay, that's the order.
Yep. And so this is obviously, part of the reason we're taking 2 whole sessions to talk about, the text and canon of the New Testament. This whole subject is a very big subject, and you can, like me, spend a lot of your spare time over the next 50 years of your life exploring all of the rabbit holes and side roads you can take in studying this, and still feel like you haven't fully captured the fullness and the enormity of it. And yet, for me and the majority of people who have done this, some at a much higher level than I, it doesn't decrease their faith, it increases their faith and confidence in what we have.
Yes, it is. And I don't think you would maybe lose, how Hebrew, to translate it word for word is possible you can't. So has anyone taken the New Testament Greek and taken that and put it in Hebrew?
Yes, there are Hebrew New Testaments that were translated from Greek into Hebrew. All of the one I'm aware of that's commonly used today are all modern ones. That is, they don't date back to the 3rd and 4th century.
So they're all more modern, like the app on my phone, right?
Well, maybe not quite that modern, but 1800s, 1900s,
Okay.
that maybe 1700s. Yes, Eric?
How would you say is a wise way to talk about these kind of things with a congregation, like just in general? Because a very uneducated, brief view of this
Mhm.
can cause a lot of doubt because you
Yeah.
hear like all these new things you never knew about. There being discrepancies
Right.
and differences,
Right.
which can, I think, especially in a normal congregation, if most people aren't going to study this out, might cause doubt in that. What would be like wise ways to come about?
Now that's a great thing to talk about. My recommendation, and what I have done over the years, is try not to overwhelm people with the great amount of information and evidence that is available. However, it is always good to let people know that a great deal more is available than what you're talking about. I tend to follow, when I usually teach in congregations or churches I'm preaching for, I usually follow some pattern, maybe along the line of F.F. Bruce's book on the New Testament documents. Are they reliable? Or even better, in some ways than that, is one by Neil Lightfoot, just like we've talked about the other brother who's a scholar from Abilene Christian University in church history. Neil Lightfoot is a biblical scholar and a member of the church and was a faculty member for many years at Abilene Christian University as well. And this one is called How We Got the Bible. So he's writing as a scholar, but he's writing on a level for ordinary folks who don't have the background yet to take this to a deeper level, and yet he's being true to the scholarly understanding without trying to overwhelm people with too much data. And I really like the way he's done it. That's one recommendation. Another one is some books that are available, particularly about translations, written by another member of the body of the Churches of Christ, also a Bible scholar, a Bible translator by the name of Jack P. Lewis. And the title of his most popular book doesn't come to mind right now, but it's about translations. And he has been on the translation committee on at least 2, maybe 3 different translations that are out in the public right now. In other words, he was on the translation committees. That's the kind of guy he is. I've heard him lecture several times, and I own at least a couple of his books. And I find them, again, he's writing for the ordinary person and member of the church to help them understand this more without trying to overwhelm them, and to reassure them as a man with a lifetime of experience in this field that we can have every confidence in the text that we have today, and that we can feel good about the translations even that we have. And even, some that might not be widely used in the United States, like the New English Bible or something like that. Nevertheless, he'll say a lot of things to commend this. Yes, there's some issues with it, but can someone learn the truth and become a Christian and live pleasing to God and be saved? Yes. And so this is a good book for that, and I think it helps address the very thing you're talking about. Now, there are some that are even briefer than these, and you may use those, but I think it's worthwhile to have some written by a more scholarly person who's toned it down to the ordinary person, because I think they're less likely to inadvertently misrepresent the facts. And so that's one I recommend. And while I'm talking about books, I brought several up here of the many I have on this subject. One actually written by the author of our textbook on Christian History Made Easy by Timothy Paul Jones. It's called Misquoting Truth. There was a book written by Bart Ehrman a number of years ago called Misquoting Jesus, in which he was arguing that almost everything recorded in the Gospels that Jesus supposedly said we can't trust. That's how he approaches everything. And he would argue that the scribes changed so much, according to his argument, that we don't know what Jesus really said, and probably most of this he didn't say, and what he did say, he probably said it differently than what our present text says. Well, that's not backed up actually by even his own scholarship. He's sort of again, this is just my opinion, and pardon me if it seemed like I'm overly critical of him, but there's this one character in one of the Batman movies that, has 2 sides to him, depending on which side you looked at, and look very different. And what was that character's name? No wonder he's called Two-Face. But in some ways, Mr. Ehrman seems to be that way. He puts out these popular books that just trashes the New Testament and everything we consider reliable and truthful about it. And yet when he writes his scholarly papers that has to go before peer reviews and, you know, as a PhD, maybe a double PhD in his subject matters and so forth, he's a very different person in those than he is in his popular publications. He makes all sorts of outrageous claims in the books that the general public will buy, perhaps knowing that's what's going to drive sales and, you know, it's going to be bestsellers, relatively speaking, while these scholarly tomes that he writes, only a few other people will see them, but he also has to answer, you know, before his peers to what he writes there. And he doesn't take nearly the same kind of extreme positions in those papers as he does in these popular writings he does for the general public. It's a very interesting situation. Yes, Mike?
It reminds me of, you know, 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give an answer
Yeah.
for hope, right? And so he think he doesn't have to answer, but if he runs across someone who is actually prepared, then you graciously and honestly challenge, you know, some of his claims that he made. So that's why it's so important that we defend.
Right.
the
Yeah,
gospel.
and of course we're not necessarily having to challenge him, but we have to sometimes talk with people who have read or heard of what he's said.
You might
and
run into him though.
that is possible. But Timothy Paul Jones misquoting truth. This is his response to Ehrman's misquoting Jesus, one of many books that have been published in response to Ehrman's thing, in which Timothy Paul Jones talks about why we can trust what we have in the gospel text as being, you know, from Jesus and what he said and how he represented both who he was and what he was about, as well as describing accurately what he did, including miracles and so forth. Yes, sir.
I have a best friend who's a skeptic, and he'll ask me a lot of questions. And he's like, "Let me show you something real quick." He showed me Bart Ehrman defending his view, and I was like, "Dude, let me show you like what Bart Ehrman's like." So I found a different interview of a different skeptic. He's also a scholar, and he's like, "I don't believe anything about the Bible. I think it's all fake. But whatever you do, don't listen to Bart Ehrman."
Isn't that interesting that another man, himself a skeptic, even considers Ehrman less than a reliable source for information on this subject? But and you know, that unfortunately that's sort of how scholarly circles sometimes work, and feels far afield of the one we're in. It's, you know, an old joke is often you get 5 PhDs together in a room on a subject, and there'll be 6 completely different opinions about something. You know, they can't even agree with each other no matter what it's about, whether it's physics, chemistry, biology, biblical text, or whatever it might be. And that doesn't make any of them right or any of them wrong per se, but it's just understanding that's how sometimes that works. But here's a couple of others. Another man we're going to be hearing a brief thing on in a few minutes here. It's called Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. Now that sounds like that he is talking about how the New Testament is corrupted. Nothing could be further from the truth. He is visiting again this commonly assumed idea that the New Testament is corrupted. He also is a Bible translator and a Bible scholar, and he's the one I mentioned to you the other day that actually operates a special sort of combination think tank and museum and digital repository for as many copies digitally of New Testament manuscripts as possible. They're kept there. They go all over the world, get permission to use real high quality digital photography to photograph these things in place wherever they are, whatever museum in the world they are, and then bring the digital version back there and archive them. His view being that at some point in the future, if the Lord doesn't come back, some disaster might strike some of these places, and those manuscripts will be lost. So let's make sure we've got digital copies of them that can be preserved for the future. And that's by Daniel B. Wallace, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. Then one who is not on our usual reading list, but it's called Encountering the Manuscripts by Philip B. Comfort. Encountering the Manuscripts basically talks about how textual criticism works. And it's again been written by someone like these other men who is a staunch believer in the reliability of the biblical text, and yet is highly recognized within his field as a scholar. Doesn't mean all other scholars in textual criticism agree with him, but that at the same time they acknowledge that he is their peer, that he's not some outsider without credentials speaking, that he is as qualified as they are to speak on this subject. And so these are just a few of the books I recommend that over time perhaps you might add to your library. Okay, let's see if I don't have time to wake my computer back up, then the screens, and then play for you a very short, about 5-minute video, because I don't think I've shown this yet. A very short video by Daniel B. Wallace that's on YouTube, and he seems, and his team seem to be wise to the fact that a lot of people go to YouTube for stuff, and so you can go to YouTube and search for Daniel B. Wallace, and you'll find a lot of his material there. Sometimes he's talking for an hour and a half or 2 hours about something, and but what we're going to be watching here is just this description of the John Ryland's fragment that we mentioned on Wednesday, this little tiny piece of the Gospel of John that was discovered in Egypt, and along with a lot of other fragments and pieces, was moved to I believe it's on the campus of the University of Oxford in England at the Rylands Museum there. And in the 20s or 30s, someone suddenly realized, hey, this might be significant. And careful research showed that it actually was a piece of the Gospel of John, dated very early, maybe AD 125, AD 110. We see different dates. And of course, it's hard to date it entirely accurately simply because the piece we have doesn't have a date written on it. And so they have to date it based on what it was found along with, the nature of the material it's written on, and other more known examples of that same material and about when that material was used, and in some cases even trying to carefully analyze the type of ink that was used and try to identify that, and even the style of which the letters. They can trace in history the scribal copyists in one certain area of the world. Over time, their handwriting, since they trained the next generation and then they trained the next generation, over the generations their handwriting gradually changed. And so they can sometimes identify by the style of the way they wrote their letters about where in history they were, even if we had no other way of doing that. Any questions about what we've said so far? There's still so much more to be said, and we won't cover near all the material. But part of my job, as I see it, in teaching this whole course on church history is not to teach you everything there is to know, but introduce you to the subject and then also give you access to resources. So that in the years to come, as you're in your ministry at whatever ministry you may have, that you have access to more resources than we actually covered in class. I know, and I've said this before, I took church history in either 69 or 70, I can't remember which year it was now. But I'm still using some of the resources I was given at that time. I didn't know at the time that I would still consider them valuable 48 years later, but I do. And I hope that will be the case with at least some of what we do here. So even though the bell's still got another minute or two to ring, let's go ahead and take our break now.